signal them. Okay, well, let's let people sit down and yeah.
Check, check. Okay. Well, good evening and welcome, faculty, staff, alumni, distinguished guests, as well as those who are joining us via live stream for this special event. I am Rao Unnava, the Michael and Joel Hurlston Dean at the UC Davis Graduate School of Management. It is our pleasure to host the second annual UC Davis Financial Times Biz Quiz, featuring a special interview of Marcie Frost conducted by Peter Spiegel. Business schools play a vital role in developing an educated workforce that drives national economic competitiveness and is prepared to address the complex challenges facing society. Thanks to the 10 business schools who have joined us in fielding teams for Biz Quiz this year: California State University, Sacramento, Colorado State University, Rice University Jones Graduate School of Business, St. Mary's of California, Cal Poly Pomona, Singleton Graduate School of Business, UC Irvine Paul Merage School of Business, UC Riverside School of Business, UC San Diego Rady School of Management, the University of San Francisco, and the USC Marshall School of Business. On behalf of UC Davis, I want to express our appreciation to the Financial Times and the staff at Financial Times who helped make Biz Quiz possible. Competitors, the preparation required for this challenge reflects your dedication to continued intellectual development, awareness of the world around you, and ability to cultivate positive habits. You were tasked with reading 40 articles per day across 10 Financial Times columns and newsletters. Tomorrow, you will be tested on your knowledge of the global economy, socially responsible businesses, market trends, energy, and more. We hope that you enjoy the competition and the friendly rivalry among schools. Best of luck, especially to UC Davis. Now, it's my honor to introduce Marcie Frost, Chief Executive Officer of CalPERS. Marcie Frost joined CalPERS as Chief Executive Officer in October 2016. She is the 9th CEO and the second woman to head America's largest pension fund. As CEO, Marcie oversees an annual budget of $1.8 billion, an experienced team of 2,800 professionals, of which over 20 are from the Graduate School of Management, and 3 lines of businesses for the fund: pensions, health benefits, and investments. CalPERS administers a defined benefit retirement system for more than 1.9 million California public sector workers and their families. CalPERS' global investment portfolios stand at roughly $400 billion. Under Marcie's leadership, CalPERS is focused on maximizing long-term investment returns to meet the fund's fiduciary responsibility to members and leverage the fund's global strength to drive sustainable markets. CalPERS is a founding member of Climate Action 100+, an initiative with 360 signatories and $34 trillion in assets under management, working cooperatively to ensure the world's largest corporate greenhouse gas emitters take necessary action to address climate change. Marcie has also been appointed as a guardian for the Council for Inclusive Capitalism at the Vatican and serves on the United Nations Global Investors for Sustainable Development Alliance. Prior to joining CalPERS, Marcie spent 30 years as a public servant in Washington State. Her early leadership roles were in human resources with an emphasis on employee benefit programs and information technology. She later was named Executive Director of the Washington State Department of Retirement Systems, where she demonstrated strong leadership and innovation, an emphasis on customer satisfaction and team collaboration. Marcie represents the United States on the International Center for Pension Management Board of Directors. I'm also pleased to introduce tonight's interviewer, Peter Spiegel. U.S. managing U.S. managing editor of the Financial Times. That's it, right? Yeah. No. Mr. Spiegel oversees the media group's editorial operations in the U.S. and the Americas from its regional headquarters in New York. He assumed the position in April 2019 after spending 3 years as news editor in London, where he oversaw the Financial Times daily news operation both in print and online. During his tenure as news editor, the Financial Times won 13 British Press Awards, the UK's highest journalism prize, including News Website of the Year in 2017 and Newspaper of the Year in 2018, only the second time the Financial Times secured British journalism's highest honor in its 130-year history. From 2010 to 2016, Mr. Spiegel served as the chief of the Financial Times Brussels Bureau. Prior to joining the Financial Times, he was Pentagon correspondent for Los Angeles Times, after which he joined the Wall Street Journal, covering foreign policy and national security issues from its Washington bureau. Mr. Spiegel earned his bachelor's degree in history from the University of Pennsylvania and a Master of Science in European Politics from the London School of Economics and Political Science. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Marcie and Peter.
Thank you, Dean. I can go back to my high school accolades as well if you want me to. First of all, I also want to thank the UC Davis team, who has just been terrific partners to work with in this event. It's really always exciting to come here. So you have a position at the Vatican? That's very exciting. I'll get to that in the interview. I want to start talking a little bit about, and the Dean touched on this, a bit about your background, because I guess I had assumed you come to head CalPERS, you're going to have some sort of asset management or sort of pure financial background, but you come from a much more public service, political background, which again, our conversation before we came on stage has come in useful. But tell me a little bit about how you sort of made the transition from sort of public policy, public service in Washington to head, which is the largest public pension in the country.
Yeah, thank you for that question. So I grew up in a very small town in Washington State. How many of you have heard of the Twilight books or the Twilight series? So you know Forks, Washington. That's where I graduated high school. And then immediately after, I had this opportunity to move to Olympia, the state capital, to do two things. One, play softball. They needed a female who could play softball in the end of the year tournament. And then also be a typist. So I started as a clerk typist too, $867 per month. I remember that very clearly. And I really had about 30 days to prove myself on the field and off the field. So that 30-day appointment turned into a 30-year career. And my last stop in Washington State was working for Governor Jay Inslee on his cabinet, running the retirement system and being the chair of the Washington State Investment Board. So I got this phone call from a search firm. CalPERS had been looking for a new CEO. Their CEO had decided to retire, the first female CEO in the 90-year history. At that time, it was about 80-year history. And it was a time that I was really enjoying the work that I was doing with Governor Inslee. He was the first person who really brought the climate crisis into my kind of world of thinking and what I might want to do with that. And so I was very attached to what his mission was, very attached to what his agenda and his platform were. But the opportunity to run CalPERS, the largest pension system in the United States, you can't say no immediately, right? You have to open up, you have to ask a lot of questions. And I was talking to your dean, and how I knew that it likely would be a good fit for me was the type of questions the board was asking me. Is this going to be a fit for my skill set? My skill set is not in asset management. My skill set is leading teams, running organizations, working with political entities, including legislatures and governors and other cabinet members. And is that really what they were looking for? Based on the types of questions they were asking me, it seemed like there was an alignment of interest there. So I went through the process. I got the second interview call when I was on the plane heading back to Seattle, and then came back out about 2 weeks later to do the second interview with the full board at that time. And there were some questions. I had some questions. Again, very happy where I was at. CalPERS had not long ago come out of a really difficult time. And, is this a place where I could be successful? i.e., was the board going to support me? It's a very public position. We're a very transparent organization. And there are people who are just not going to like what you do every day. And they're going to question you on that. You're going to question your personal ethics. They're going to question your professional credibility. And so for me, it was making sure that I had a board, unanimous board, saying this is the person we want. And so when they called to offer me the job, that was the first question I asked the board president at the time was, what was the vote? And the vote was 13-0. So I decided to say yes. October of 2016, just after your dean started here, I started at CalPERS as its CEO.
So one of the things you said before we got on stage, which I was amazed at, is that you're now at 7 years. You are the longest serving CEO of CalPERS.
Longest serving at 7 years.
Which is
yes.
says something about the politics involved. And you mentioned that it was sort of one of the things that was sort of your skill set. Tell me about, and you mentioned you became CEO after a difficult time for CalPERS, a lot of focus on ethics and stuff like that. Tell me a little bit about, has that been harder or were you prepared, do you think, for that public scrutiny when you came to the job from your previous experience in Washington?
I thought I was prepared. You're never really prepared for the type of scrutiny that comes in this job or even the chief investment officer role. But we had watched CalPERS. We saw CalPERS really struggling to go through that very difficult time. But immediately upon entering the organization, you saw the talent in the organization. You saw the drive to really repair the relationship that had happened. And remember, out of the 2,800 employees, there was only one person in the organization that was really the problem. The rest of the organization was excellent and was really just trying to figure out how to get out of this, bad time. And so, yeah, I think underestimating a bit, but I also don't know that you can really understand the impact of it until you're sitting in the seat and you're starting to get the questions or you're starting to get, well, that doesn't, I don't agree with that. Why did they hire someone without a college degree, right? That was the first thing that I had to address back in 2018.
The public scrutiny, well, let me change it because you mentioned that, let me ask you, is it difficult to be CEO of an organization like CalPERS without the asset management background? Because you must have to lean pretty heavily on your team when it comes to making investment decisions.
I don't make the investment decisions. I ask a lot of questions about manager selection, the type of thematics that we're looking at investing the $460 billion portfolio, but I'm not making the day-to-day investment decisions. We hire a very talented team that does that. I have a chief investment officer that does that. That chief investment officer reports into me. So I'm the executive of the fund. I'm not the investor of the fund.
So the question I was going to ask is would you consider this political role, this scrutiny that you get from legislature, from the media, is that probably the hardest part of your job, would you say?
Depending on the day, yeah, right. Depending on the day, that it can be very, very difficult. There was a story today about the revolving door at CalPERS for this chief investment officer role, and it's not truly reflective of the types of skill sets that we need in this role. There are three main things that we need, and I know we want to talk about that a little bit later, but it can be very distracting. And the secret, I think, that I've found, and I've worked through this over 7 years, is you have to figure out what really matters to the organization, what is really going to be an impediment to you moving forward and getting the results for your 2 million members. And if it doesn't matter, you have to compartmentalize it. You have to develop that thick skin to say, this doesn't matter if it's personal, doesn't matter if it's professional, but you got to move forward. And your critics win when they get in your way. You can't let those critics get in your way when they're being critical of something that is not relevant to the work of the organization.
If you don't mind me, let me push you a bit about this, because I think all leaders say that, but we're all human beings, and we have friends, we have family who read these criticisms, and how easy is that to compartmentalize that this is, you're going to go home and, I don't know, your parents call up and said, honey, I saw this piece, and are you really as terrible as they say? I mean, it could be bruising even to someone in a prominent position.
Yeah.
How do you compartmentalize that?
It's actually gotten easier over time because there's so much of it. But it's gotten easier over time. I would say early on, I'd be walking down to my public affairs team, Brad Pacheco, who's here with me, and I'm like, what the heck is this? Right, I don't know the history on this. Why are they coming at us on this particular topic or this particular decision that we made in the portfolio? Typically, it's about the investment portfolio, because when you have $400 billion, $460 billion, $500 billion, people want to tell you how to invest it. And they really don't want you investing it for yourself. They want you to be sending that out to the external managers. So it's gotten easier. I have a great set of friends here. I have a great assistant. I have Kara Buchanan. She's here with me as well. But you have a support system, including my family. I have 3 children who live in Washington and Oregon. And if I'm having a really hard day, you know, I talk to my children. I have 5 grandchildren. And you remember what's most important and the reason that you took the role. And it's not about your critics.
Reason you took the role. So let me, the flip side of that question, if that's some of the hardest stuff you have to do, what do you find most enjoyable about the job?
Yeah, leading the team, by far, it's about getting the team the support that they need to be able to be successful. That is by far my favorite part of my job, is just working with our 2,800 employees.
It's interesting something you said, again, before we were on stage, you talk about, you know, attracting talent. I want to get to that too, but you say a lot of people who sort of early in their career who want to get experience, but also people at the end of the career who sort of want to give back, because it is, again, for an asset manager to have sort of a public interest mission must be rewarding as part of the job as well.
Yeah, it should be. If you're not attracted to the mission of this organization, and we are a defined benefit plan, which means, you know, you have your defined contribution plans, you have your defined benefit plans. Defined benefit means there's a formula that if you work a certain number of years at a certain age, and then there's a multiplier for that, you get this guaranteed lifetime benefit. And you don't get that with a defined contribution plan. You have to really think about how do you do your decumulation of your contributions, where a defined benefit pays for your lifetime. And if you choose to cover a beneficiary, then your benefit gets reduced in order to cover your beneficiary's lifetime as well. So, you know, these are really important things. And if you're not aligned to the mission, we're really not a place to work. But we are seeing a lot of newer employees, early career employees wanting to come in and spend the first part of their career at CalPERS. It is still a very good thing to have CalPERS on your resume. So as you're out looking for jobs, you should really come talk to us. We would love to talk with you about that. We have a lot of alum, as we've indicated, but I have 2 alums on my executive team as well, including our interim chief investment officer, who's quite loyal to this school. So again, mission is extremely important, but having a bit, I call it that competitive fire, but it has to be healthy fire, that we are expecting to get a 6.8% return on that $460 billion over long periods of time. So typically when we are at odds, whether it's a legislative bill or it's perhaps the stakeholder groups, I've really come to the conclusion that it's more about time horizon. Right? So a lot of people are thinking more shorter term. You know, if you're a legislator, you might have a 4-year term, a 6-year term, and you're trying to get results within that time frame. Well, those results may not fit with a long-term investor like CalPERS. And I think the primary example of that is when we're talking to the legislature about, do we divest from certain assets or certain sectors from the fund? But to me, I've really boiled that down to a time horizon issue.
Let me shift now from the personal to sort of more the substantive, and let me start, given this is sort of mostly an audience of business students, talk a bit about the role of pension funds, because I think it's one of those things that gets overlooked frequently. I mean, when we think about asset managers, we think about BlackRock, or on the retail front, we think about Vanguard or Fidelity, and then there's sort of the private equity and, you know, the Apollos and the KKRs of the world. Very rarely do people think about pension funds. They are enormous pools of capital, but no one. It's very infrequent that they make headlines or get the attention. Tell me a bit about the role pensions play on Wall Street on investing, but also, I know it's not specifically your job, but I'm curious how you actually invest the money. How much of it is decided by your in-house analysts and how much it is outsourced to some of these big asset managers or private equity funds. Tell me a little bit how you make your investment decisions.
Sure. So we have a 13-person board, and that board is composed of, we've got the state treasurer, we've got the state controller, we have 6 positions that are elected by the membership of CalPERS. We've got the California HR lead on our board, we've got the mayor of Palm Springs, the locally elected official. And so the board, one of the primary responsibilities that they have is to determine what we call the strategic asset allocation. So how, across the various asset classes, will this $460 billion be invested? So how much goes into public equity, which we're global investors, so how much goes into global equity, how much goes into global fixed income, how much goes into private equity, private credit, real assets, which includes real estate and infrastructure. So how much of these assets go into those various classes? So the board makes that decision. They made that decision 4 years ago. We just had a 2-year check-in. And that 2-year check-in was really interesting. So when we did the 4-year cycle, we were concerned about getting access to some of the alternative asset classes like private equity and private credit. What we found is the deal flow available to CalPERS is really positive. And there's a couple things happening. You saw the downturn in the markets. Some of our not really competitors, but other public pension funds, other institutional investors, they hit their policy targets very quickly based on that denominator effect. Their assets under management declined during that time. So they were at their policy targets. They didn't have liquidity available to invest in these illiquid assets. So what we are bringing back to the board in March is an additional allocation both to private equity and to private credit, reducing the global public equity and changing the way that we invest in global fixed income, just to make sure we've got that right balance between liquidity and illiquidity. So most of the portfolio is managed internally. Most of it is passive. Global public equity is really an indexed strategy, although we're looking at moving more active strategies into that portfolio. The global fixed income portfolio used to be about 90% managed internally. It's about 70% managed internally. We now are moving towards some of these more active managers where we have high conviction.
And that's in-house active management, or do you go out to?
We go outside on active management right now. And there may come a time, a decade out from now, we might look at doing things more directly. But right now, if you have a high conviction manager where we're getting, say, private equity, we're getting really good co-investment terms. That's really attractive for CalPERS. Yeah. So an example there, $7 billion allocated into the private equity portfolio, 7 billion co-investments, which means no fee, no management fee, and no carry. So really good terms for CalPERS. $2 billion of that went to diverse managers, just on the natural, just naturally investing, naturally underwriting, and doing our due diligence.
Let me push you a little bit. I know you're not the CIO, so you don't get directly involved in this, but just we were just again talking before we went on the stage about you're not very much in New York, and I was thinking, oh gosh, how does someone who runs that much money not go and do the road show in New York? I'm like, oh, actually, they must come to you. Yeah. So we have $460 billion under assets. Tell me a little bit of that process. Yeah. If I am a big asset manager or a private equity firm or VC, and I want your investment, how does that work? Just take me through the sort of the process there.
Well, being a larger investor, it's very difficult to write the small checks. So we typically are working with the main managers in the space. Whether that we don't really have BlackRock managing any of our assets. We purchased some technology from BlackRock. But if we want KKR, if we want Blackstone, if we want Apollo, we can call them, or they're in their fundraising cycle, so they're reaching out to CalPERS. And there may have been a period of time where we felt that we were a little bit lower on the Rolodex, so we were going out more to those GPs. We now believe that we've improved those relationships, and now we have those GPs coming into CalPERS in Sacramento.
Let me turn a bit to we talked about it briefly, but sort of the war for talent, since we got people who are graduating business school here. I don't want to say make your pitch, but the names you mentioned, again, are bold-faced names, for lack of a better word. And how do you compete with a BlackRock or with some of the private equity firms when you're trying to get the best talent at a business school to help run your investment portfolio?
It's very difficult to compete with the private equity firms. They're paying compensation 6-7 times what we're able to pay. And typically that's where I was indicating to you that we get people earlier in their career. We have internship programs. We turn those internship programs into job offers. So we start developing our own pipeline. And developing that pipeline also means we create a little bit of loyalty and interest in this mission that we have. And I think what we found with some of the workers coming in today, and we talked about this as well, is that it has to be a combination of, it has to be kind of connected to my heart and my mind, my profession, as well as something I'm passionate about doing. That's why I do what I do. My grandparents, and I grew up very, very humbly, but my grandparents didn't have access to a retirement plan. And as they aged, I saw what that did to my grandfather in particular, who was always, the provider of the family. And if I can be in a place to make sure that doesn't happen to 2 million people in California, I'm going to sign up for that. So when I get up in the morning, I'm very excited about what we get to do. That mission is really compelling. And then I get to work with this wonderful team. But compensation will never be able to match what a KKR is paying an analyst or a portfolio manager. But we have a different value proposition, and so it's really up to the candidate. What's your value proposition? What are you really interested in doing with your career? Is it early career, you want to make as much as you can and go work in a, where you don't have as much work-life balance? To be perfectly frank, we really operate on the work-life balance, and we have, this apprenticing program that we do in our investment office, and you get a lot of exposure. We put people in places. I always say we're a teaching hospital. We're going to put you in places where you can really, you can thrive. If you make a mistake, let's make sure we're failing forward, that we're not continuing to make that same mistake over and over. But we're going to put you in places where you get to use the best that you have.
Teaching hospital. I like that analogy, but I must imagine that you bring on talented people who are committed to the mission and doing it for the right reasons. You bring them in, you do your teaching hospital thing, you skill them up, and then boom, they leave. That must be frustrating.
It's really expected.
Yeah, okay.
It really is. It's expected. If we can keep the best talent we can get, even 2-3 years, that's better than hiring someone who doesn't have that talent. So we're getting the best out of you for 2 to 3 years before you decide to launch your career in another place. So it's not frustrating. It does get covered a lot about the amount of turnover that we see, but we just looked post-pandemic. 30% of the 2,800 employee organization has turned over. 30% of this organization turned over because there was a lot of recruitment of our team, and it was really recruited at that mid-career level. So we had vacancies at the mid-career, so we had to develop out the entry-level positions, and we're going to fast-track people into those jobs. That's, I think, a compelling story for why someone like you all would want to come to CalPERS.
So one area where you did have turnover, which I suspect you did want to have turnover, as you mentioned, is the chief investment officer.
It is.
And you lost someone came on board, lost them again. It sounded like a lot of the pressures that you experienced yourself, public scrutiny, intense spotlight, kind of hit your CIO too. Talk to me a bit about how problematic it is to have high turnover in that position, and how hard it is going to be to replace them given the pressures you were just describing.
So 7 years on the job, and this will be my 4th chief investment officer.
Wow.
And that is a very high churn rate for any organization in a key position, and this is definitely a key position. But it goes really back to the stable, the second layer in the investment office has been there for a very long time. And the chief investment officer does not create the strategies independently of this team. And so we've got the interim CIO who's been at CalPERS for 17 years. We've got the head of our fixed income team who's been at CalPERS for 35 years. And so we have a lot of tenure there. But I think the best way to describe it is exactly how I mentioned it earlier. It isn't until you sit in this seat that you know what it feels like. So everyone, we go through the traditional interviewing questions, the simulation, what would you do in this particular example, and people think they have it until it happens. So remember, our chief investment officer just prior to Nicole Musico was a gentleman named Ben Meng. Who could have expected that the U.S. government was going to come after him because he was Chinese and accuse him of diverting CalPERS funds to China? That was the accusation. Congressman Jim Banks came out and made that allegation pretty clearly on social media. Fox News covered it. And this is just someone who has a lot of integrity, came to CalPERS because he wanted to give back. He had been at CalPERS once before. He had a view on what he called the 7% strategy. And this really knocked him off his game. There was a lot of fear. He had a lot of fear. He lost about 40 pounds, frankly, in about 6 weeks. And I don't know how we train someone for that. And then you get Nicole Musico, who, she decided that, based on the fact that her son was not returning to California with her, that, she needed to go back to Canada and be with her family. And I'm not going to mom shame this woman who made a decision for her family, but 18 months for Ben, 18 months for Nicole, that churn rate does take its toll on an organization. Not from the strategy level. It really has not changed. The strategy has not changed. Between Ben Meng, 7% strategy, more private assets, obviously the capital market assumptions say you're going to get a higher return on those illiquid assets. That strategy has not changed, but the impact that it has on people around leadership and kind of this constancy and, I know who my CIO is, that does take its toll.
So what do you say now to, I mean, obviously you're out there with a search committee and trying to find another CIO. What do you say to a candidate who might have all the qualifications but see, oh gosh, the last two lasted 18 months and saw the headlines? How do you convince someone to sort of, again, because it is the mission, right? You're kind of doing it because you want your heart to be in it, when actually they know that there's all sorts of other things going to come in the background. How do you recruit someone in that environment?
Well, interestingly enough, we just had a subcommittee, and I have a shared responsibility with the board for hiring this particular position. It's the only one at CalPERS that we have that shared requirement. But there are 55 candidates that have already reached out to them, 53 candidates who have come through CalPERS, and I've had a number of inquiries come into me as well. So interestingly enough, it doesn't seem to slow the interest.
Okay.
And so people choosing us, we just need to make sure that when you're making a choice to come to CalPERS, that you really know what that choice means, how that could impact you personally in particular, and professionally if you're earlier or mid-career. And so I'm not seeing any problems in the candidate flow, interestingly enough.
Yeah.
I was quite surprised by that as well. But we never have seen that. We've always had really great candidates to choose from. Nicole was a great candidate. We just personal things ended up, interfering with her tenure.
And I think I heard you said you suspect sometime early mid next year when you're probably going to make that announcement?
I would expect first quarter next year.
Okay, and you'll tell the Financial Times before you tell anyone else, is that?
Brad? Brad, what do you say to that?
Let me talk about, you've mentioned it several times, but I want to push you a bit on the allocation. And I think either you or Nicole mentioned in the page of the Financial Times that part of the reason you wanted to allocate more outside the public markets and into private markets is because you felt you didn't get the returns, particularly in private equity, but also venture capital and private credit. Let me ask you a bit about the timing, because there is a lot of talk right now about private equity in particular, that in a rising interest rate environment, all these deals they do are based on debt, right? And debt is expensive. Are they going to get the kind of returns that you guys missed out on in the last 10 years? Take me a little bit through your thinking about the timing of moving your assets from public to private markets.
Yeah, so the private credit market is quite hot right now, as you can imagine. And we sit somewhere between a traditional bank and a private equity firm. And so the terms of those deals, I can't get into too much specifics, but there's a ton of deal flow there, which is why we will be recommending an additional 4%. So we're 5% of the $460 billion going to the private credit strategy. We're going to request from the board in March to increase that by another 4%. Private equity, the leverage on some of those companies, that's something we watch for in our underwriting and our due diligence. The co-investment really helps with some of, that fee drag that we've seen. But in order to get that 6.8 over long periods of volatility in the markets, the private assets are extremely important. We did a 15-year look back for the board. It's one of the first presentations I asked Nicole to do because she was a new CIO. There was no ownership over that performance. There was no ownership over those decisions. The 15-year look back showed how much money was lost by the fact that we were not pacing capital into private equity. We essentially had stopped just after the global financial crisis. We were concerned about liquidity. We had a very large, sell-off in the public equity binder. And the team and others were really concerned that this was going to happen again. So they wanted to keep things more liquid. But we lost out in a significant amount of return simply by the fact that we were not consistently pacing that capital. So that lesson learned, we cannot repeat that problem, even if the terms and the levering and interest rate environment, you have to have that consistency.
Will the new CIO who comes in have another look at that, or is this is set by the board and therefore they're going to have to implement it?
It's set by the board. We would not expect a CIO to be hired who would not be supportive of this strategy.
You mentioned private credit as well, which, as you said, this seems to be the area that all private capital seems to be moving into. But let me throw a journalistic skepticism to it, because sometimes I worry slightly about this sector because it really blossomed after the financial crisis, because many of the traditional banks were sort of so regulated out of, I don't want to say riskier, but probably say potentially higher returning loans. It has moved to the private capital market, and there's always in the back of my mind a worry that this is less regulated in the banking sector, therefore the loans are more risky, and they're being managed portfolios by, in some cases, private equity firms that have less experience in actuarial, accounting. Are you worried about increased allocation into a sector that is, in essence, by definition, riskier than the loans the banks take, with less regulation, less transparency?
We really haven't been, because where we put ourselves in the debt structure, right?
Okay.
We have to have the high quality, otherwise we don't underwrite that deal.
Okay.
So where we're at in the debt structure, we believe balances the risk and return.
Okay, so not getting into high yield or junk bonds or anything like that. Okay.
No junk bonds.
Okay, I'm just looking at the time. In
Yeah.
about 10 minutes, I'm going to sort of go to questions. I've been told that in a very high-tech way, we're not going to have microphones. There is, I think, QR codes on your seat, and those also playing at home. Actually, questions are already showing up on my iPad, so people are doing it. Please enter your questions here. My team will make sure they're. I only get the easy questions, but also if you're online, you can ask questions there as well. Now you mentioned a couple times an investment portfolio of illiquid, and I think a good portion you've talked about this is in commercial real estate. Now, I must say, in New York City, there's a huge percentage of commercial real estate that is now empty. And I know in Northern California, it's even worse. Tell me your thoughts about having a rather large portfolio of commercial real estate right now, and how concerned you are about that.
Yeah, so as we look at June 30th is the time that we report out our performance on the portfolio. There will be write-downs on the commercial portfolio. We typically are urban and coastal, which San Francisco, New York, and there will be some write-downs in that. Now, what the economists say about the evolution of those properties and what might happen in the cities of bringing workers back or reutilization of some of those properties, that's something that we have to watch very carefully. But right now, we would have a pretty significant write-down in that part of the portfolio.
And as you look forward in terms of asset allocation, are you now trying to trim your sales in that area for that reason, or?
A bit.
Okay.
I mean, I can't get into a lot of
Fair
detail
enough.
there
Okay.
because some of these properties are, currently under, consideration.
Got it.
But only under the terms that we think are holding the valuation in the books. So even with the write-down, there has to be a valuation that fulfills the fiduciary duty that we have at CalPERS. We can't just do a fire sale and a sell-off. It has to actually, pay the fund and pay the benefits.
So that's code word. If you're looking to buy commercial real estate, talk to Marcie after the event.
Not really.
There's a couple questions here, and I actually had it myself. I'll try to group them together, but it's over the general heading of ESG. Now, we've seen a bit going back and forth on this. It used about 5 years ago, it was the hottest thing out there. We would have events and everyone wanted to attach their name to it. We are environmentally sensitive, we like governance, we're into societal issues.
Yeah.
We have seen a huge political backlash, not in California, but certainly in Texas, in Florida, even on the federal level, they call it woke capitalism. Tell me a little bit about how you position yourself in ESG and how you deal with that sort of political back and forth as well.
So CalPERS has had a position on environmental, social, and governance issues for a very long time, far before I ever came to the fund. And if you are a long-term investor, you need to be thinking about the risks related to climate. You need to be thinking about the risks related to, worker safety or, more recently, labor principles. You need to think about how these companies are being governed. The board of directors, are they independent? Is the executive compensation, is it actually tied to the performance of the company? All things that CalPERS has always cared about. But I think what's a bit different, the political environment has gotten to be quite different, and we get a lot of questions on what we're doing. So obviously we're going to underwrite at a long-term risk, but we're also going to think about this just energy transition, that there will be an energy transition sometime, in the future. We've made a commitment to be net zero in the portfolio by 2050, but frankly, here's a call to action for you all. The technology does not exist to decarbonize the economy by 2050. It just doesn't exist today. So that's kind of a call to action to all the entrepreneurs out there to help us figure out these net zero technologies. It's if you have conviction and you're not green, you heard the terms greenwashing and now you're hearing the term green hushing. If you really believe that this is a risk return analysis, you're not going to be hushed during this period of time. So we just announced just this week, we just had board meetings, our new 2030 plan, which is the $100 billion commitment to more climate-friendly companies, as well as more investment in diverse managers. And so we're getting a lot of questions on that. What does enhanced engagement really look like? We'll have a framework that'll come back in July to the board. But this enhanced framework is around if we are engaging with a company, we do a lot of corporate engagement, and we have great relationships with those companies today. Those companies are making commitments to a lot of the investors. The issuers are talking to the investors, making commitments. There's a lot of information furnished. There's not enough information filed. And filed meaning it can be audited. It's investment decision worthy. And so if we find that companies are not making meaningful progress in the energy transition, and we believe that that risk is not being managed for our 2 million members, then we have some other tools that we can use. We can underweight that company in the portfolio. If we think another company is doing quite well, they're fulfilling their commitments, they're moving on progress, then we can overweight that company in the portfolio. What's yet to be determined by our investors is the framework by which we would institute that. So looking forward to that in July. But in the meantime, $53 billion of that $100 billion has already been allocated into those more climate-friendly technologies or climate-friendly companies. And so we'll be able to get more public about what those companies are. We're developing new relationships with managers, new relationships with energy companies that are really evolving to meet the needs. I think there's much more of a consumer demand today to have things that are clean, a more cleaner energy, more cleaner vehicles. We have a lot of work to do on the infrastructure. We have a lot of work to do on EV pricing so that, the $35,000 retiree out of CalPERS can actually afford an electric vehicle and then have the confidence that they can actually charge it on an appropriate amount of time, and they don't get, the range anxiety that I sometimes get when I'm driving mine.
$100 million, that's a significant chunk of your
large.
portfolio. Mm-hmm. So you mentioned that you have to, you're always watching out for climate risks. So if I own a apartment building in South Florida that's going to be underwater in 5 years, you have to take that into consideration.
Yeah.
But this is a significant, again, not to put words in your mouth, this does sound like using your assets in almost a policy perspective. You are trying to drive or contribute to the drive towards a cleaner climate through, because that's what ESG investing essentially is trying to do, which is through capital investment, drive the climate change. Is that a fair assessment of what you're trying to do with this $100 billion? Or?
So I think it's more reflective of the conversations we've been having with companies for a very long time. There is this pent-up desire for companies to start really investing in from brown to green, if we're talking about the energy sector. And so where can a capital allocator like CalPERS, where can we help invest in that transition? But it still has to fulfill the fiduciary duty of the fund. We can't just give money to a company because we like what they're doing. Yeah. We can only allocate or invest in a company that we think we're going to get the right return from. So it's that balance of, we've got to get the return, but we're going to find the companies that are really working on the transition that have this better alignment to the 2050.
So, because that is, in some ways, the criticism you hear, which is, if you're a public pension fund, your first responsibility is return.
It is.
And it shouldn't matter if this person is green or brown or whatever, you want the return. Talk to me a little bit about that internal discussion, how you ensure both things, because sometimes they are mutually exclusive. The cost of transition is expensive. Not every green company has as good returns as ExxonMobil. How do you balance that and get that balance right?
Yeah, so there's I think the number is $3 trillion for an actual true energy transition, and it's going to take some time to do that. But the internal conversations are essentially the way that I just described them, is where can we find investment opportunities that fulfill both sides of our priorities? And they're out there. And so there's some disbelief and still some climate deniers out there, but there's still some disbelief that the energy transition is going to happen. We see it in California. We have a large part of the portfolio that is invested in California. Our real assets portfolio has, sun, solar, wind technologies in it. I think 40% of that portfolio has been invested in more cleaner energy. But the conversations are, where can we find the ands? It's not the or. It's never the or. It's where can we find the ands? Return, and there are a lot more ands out there.
Another question coming here on this topic. Do you actively, lobby has a dirty word, it seems like a dirty word, but do you actively engage, that's a better one, with California state or even federal legislators on this issue to try to move the dial on it?
We do, and most of the engagements or the conversations are really for education and communication. There's a lot of confusion out there. There is not a consistent definition of ESG. As an example, we have a definition that we use. Sometimes I wish we'd throw the ESG word out and just call it sustainable investing, something really simple like that. But we do engage with the legislature, and particularly if there are bills that would impact CalPERS, like a divestment bill or a reporting bill. We love reporting bills. Transparency is our friend. So we love those. We get behind those right away. But when it comes to divesting from a particular sector in the portfolio, the concern is it's more of this sledgehammer effect, like you're chiseling this out of the portfolio, and there are really unintended consequences that could violate the board's fiduciary duty or the CIO's fiduciary duty or mine. So we prefer to be more precise, right? Use analytics, really think through, make investment assumptions that if we decide to underweight a company or overweight a company, that's a company, not a sector. And that precision is really what's critical to continuing to move forward in this transition.
Interesting. So how open have legislators been to that argument? Because obviously there is always movements to say no investment in the oil or gas industry, no investment in regions, Russia, that kind of thing. How successful you've been in sort of convincing companies, legislators, that actually it's better if we go company by company as opposed to?
Yeah, I think it's mixed. I think that Senate Bill 252 is the bill we're talking about, which would require us to divest from the 200 top emitters. The Senate did pass it out of their side, and then it moved over to the Assembly. It did not make it out of the PERS committee. There's a new chair, Chair McKinnon, who really wanted to understand the impacts to the bill before she would give it a hearing. Now, it's a bill that could come back and likely will come back. But that argument about, again, I think it comes back to we're long-term investors. There's a short-term view. Let's just get this done. Why are we investing in any kind of fossil fuel? But you have to understand that decarbonizing the economy is more than the oil and gas sector. So CalPERS' approach is one that I think is more, holistic, where the entire economy, the entire portfolio, we need to help work to decarbonize that, not just chisel out this particular sector. So I think on some days that argument resonates quite well. Other days it doesn't. They just, they want that quick win.
Really interesting question here about, again, how CalPERS operates. And the question is basically, do you engage with individual companies on these kinds of things? Because again, when we talked about it at the opening remarks, you said very reliant on indexing, which is obviously not particularly companies involved. If you're going to the BlackRocks or the private equity, you're not really engaging with individual companies. But it sounds like on a lot of these green issues, you are actually looking at individual companies. And are you doing direct investments in the companies yourself, or how does that work?
So Climate Action 100 Plus is a group of investors, and it's an engagement effort by $55 trillion in assets behind this engagement effort. As a part of it, each of the institutional investors, like a CalPERS, we have companies that we directly engage with. So we have a set of companies that we directly engage with. And we've built very strong relationships with the teams. So like our teams talk to these companies on a regular basis to really understand what they're doing in the space, what assets are they acquiring, what's their path, scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. When will you start filing that versus furnishing it? The SEC is wrestling with that right now, while the ISSB has already passed their standards there, and hopefully that will be a global standard. But we do engage with individual companies. We do engage with private equity companies as well. We co-founded with Carlyle, which is one of the major GPs, what we call the Data Convergence Project. And that is taking information out of the portfolio companies, such as emissions, scope 1, scope 2 emissions, workplace safety, employee engagement. And so there are 6 pieces of data that get reported to us on these portfolio companies out of the private equity side. So some would say, or I would say, that in some cases we're getting better data from the private equity portfolio companies than we're getting from some of the public companies.
Let me just take a step back, and separate from climate and ESG, because it spurred a question in my mind, which is, there is still, a concern is the wrong word, but there has been a mantra, I guess, that a lot of companies are staying private for longer because there's so much liquidity out there, they don't have to go to the public markets. That means that being able to invest in these companies, some of them very high growth, basically falls to venture capital firms and other sort of similar early stage investors. Do you engage in that kind of stuff? You as playing as an early venture capital investor? Is that something you'd like to get into, or do you work with a Sequoia or some of these other VC firms to get in early? How do you capitalize on some of these early stage, and even in some cases mid-stage companies that are not going public, to get the kind of returns that some of the VCs have been able to get?
We actually just re-entered the venture space. We had been out for a period of time. We hired a new managing investment director over private equity, Anton Orlich. And so we've just re-entered that venture space because the deal flow and the opportunity set is quite different. Early stage is still difficult for a CalPERS. Some of those checks are way too small, and we have a finite set of resources. And we tend to underwrite managers, not underwrite particular deals in the co-investment space. But we would be more mid to late stage venture, and Sequoia would be someone obviously we would be interested in.
So you work through a venture capital firm. You're not sort of investing
No, we're not
in my
doing
company
direct.
I'm starting in my
We are not.
All right, too bad.
Did you have a company?
Well, we'll talk about it after the session. peterspiegel.com. There was an interesting question here, which I'm embarrassed to admit I did not realize, which is, although you are enormous, you don't have the entirety of the public sector pension fund in California.
We do not.
The teachers, some of you might be interested, CalSTRS, he's outside. And if someone asked, I guess it's a little in the weeds, but I'm interested in the answer. Had there ever been talk about CalSTRS and CalPERS getting together, given that you do very similar things? There are efficiencies to be had there. Has that ever been mooted?
Not that I'm aware of. I think that would be extremely difficult. I mean, these are organizations that have been in existence for decades and have their own independent boards who oversee. And so CalSTRS has only the teachers. They have one retirement plan. They have a single stakeholder group, and then you bring in CalPERS, and we have everyone else other than the 39 ACT cities or counties. So Alameda, for example, has its own. Marin has its own. San Joaquin. And so I don't think that would work.
Okay.
Yeah, and I'm not aware of any proposal in our history.
So someone asked here, I guess I brought it up earlier about Russian assets and companies. Let me ask it in a bigger way. We obviously have a number of asset bans. Russian companies, now we're seeing the Treasury Department put out constraints on Iran and other things. How do you manage that? I mean, do you have your own due diligence to make sure your portfolio is not invested in things that have been prescribed by the federal government? How difficult is it to manage that, and how have you tried to sort of, again, divesting is I guess the word. Have you been forced to divest in some of your funds or some of your assets because of moves the government has made on, again, Russia or Iran or some of these other bans? Yeah,
so we really look to the federal government, and this came up not so long ago on investments in China.
Yeah.
And the Office of Foreign Asset Control is the one who will blacklist, a particular, geography. And so the index providers do pair up with that OFAC list. And so what we're able to invest in is representative of that list. It doesn't mean that we haven't divested from companies. We divested from the tobacco industry. We divested from Iran. We have an Iran reporting bill still that we provide to the legislature. We are not in private prisons, but that's more from a capital structure move that we made about 2 years ago. But the divestment that continues to cost us money is tobacco.
Okay.
Yeah, so we're lagging about $4 billion on tobacco.
Wow, okay. But it sounds like, at least on the OFAC stuff, you don't individually have to worry about that because the funds that you're invested in take care of that for you.
Yeah, the index providers will take care of that for us.
You mentioned China, though, because it's interesting. From a corporate perspective, we've had CEOs come through town in New York and meet with the FT who are very concerned about their China business because if the U.S. government responds to a Chinese invasion of Taiwan the way they responded to a Russian invasion of Ukraine, suddenly there's a huge amount of business they're going to lose. Do you do any sort of risk assessment or gaming that kind of stuff out as you look at where you're invested?
Our China holdings are very, very small.
Okay.
They just are very small. We have a little bit in our real estate portfolio, very, very little in our private equity portfolio, and the remainder really is in the public equity. So it's in the index. We haven't omitted China from the index as an example. I know the Federal Thrift Board just did that, but we have not done that yet. But very, very small holdings in China.
No holding on TikTok? As far as you know. So this is a very esoteric question, but it keeps getting upvoted, so I guess I'm going to ask it. It's a question about beneficiaries who die, or people who have CalPERS pensions and have no beneficiaries.
Oh.
Is there a way for CalPERS to deal with that, in that there's no one around to take their assets?
I know, it's a sad situation.
Yeah.
So the way that the benefit stream is calculated, so you make contributions as an employee, a public sector employee, and your employer makes contributions, and then you have the investment earnings. So about 56 cents of your pension benefit is paid out of investment earnings, another third comes from the employer, and then you have the smaller portion of it. So it's about 3 years before someone runs out of their actual contributions that they put into the system.
Okay.
Most of your pension benefit is funded out of the investment returns. So if you have a member who has passed away a year to 3 years, and they still likely would have money on account.
Yeah.
So we would attempt to find a beneficiary in that situation. We would always attempt to find a beneficiary. But we do have cases where they've done a single life and no beneficiary on record, and that's mortality. That's part of the mortality assumption.
And you take that money, go to Vegas, put it on red. No? Okay.
No, it's part of the assumptions.
Okay.
It's how we fund the plan.
Yeah,
We
that's what
expect some
actuaries are
people
for.
will live
Yeah.
here, some people
Yeah.
will not live as long.
There was an interesting question here, which I hadn't thought of, which is, it's a little bit of chicken the egg. If you're, as an institutional investor, do you find fund managers to invest in that are aligned with your values and your vision? Or do you say, here is our values and our vision, and we're going to invest in you, you execute it? Which comes first, I guess, in the question? Do you, as the fund managers come through town and do their road show,
Yeah.
do you listen to them about what their values are and decide whether that matches what you're interested in? Or is it vice versa? This is what we want to do. Pitch me on how you're going to do it.
Well, it's typically a conversation, and it's a conversation with a bit of a divide, and that divide is getting smaller over time. But if you take private equity as an industry, when it began back in 1981 or 82, there was a big divide between the values of the private equity firm and the values of a pension fund. But I would say those things are starting to narrow, and the most recent example of that would be the labor principles that we lifted out of various policies, put as a standalone document.
Yeah.
There are several GPs that have already committed to those labor principles, but it's in the details. So what happens when you have a labor dispute? How is that private equity company responding to a labor dispute? And is it at a sufficient level based on the values that a CalPERS would have? Where our board, we have a lot of labor representatives on our board who are very demanding about human capital, and so although it's narrowing, there's still a bit of a divide, and we are seeking returns and getting the best values we can from those returns. Okay. That's really what it comes down to.
We're at that point in the session. We're down to our last question. I'm not going to take it from the thing. I'll do my own question. I made this in the best way. When you described your career at the beginning, it was almost an accidental career, in that you went from softball star to CEO of CalPERS, almost, I don't want to say by accident, but one a step at a time. Yeah. If you were to start all over again and say, I'd like to do something else with my life, what would that other thing be? If you were not running a giant
I love what I do, and it wasn't accidental. It was all intentional. Based on the opportunity set I had before me. One of the, I think the hallmarks of my career is I chose leaders. I didn't choose jobs. Right? So I chose people who were going to be my ally, who were going to help me, be my sponsor, teach me things that, again, I didn't have the formal education, but I worked for some amazing people. If I wasn't doing this, I have this creative side to me as well, so I likely would be doing something closer to what my younger daughter does, which is in the design business. She is a part owner of a female-owned company in Portland, Oregon.
Oh, fantastic.
And
do you want to plug
that's
it?
what she does. Vita Design.
So last year I asked the CEO of Franklin Templeton that question. She said she wanted to be a cowgirl. So,
a cowgirl? Okay.
Yeah.
No, not that.
Not a cowgirl? Okay.
No, not
Great.
that.
Anyway, please help me thank Marcie Frost, the CEO of CalPERS. Thanks very much.
Thank you.